3 miles above the ceiling of every fighter jet ever built, a man is alone with his own heartbeat. He is moving faster than a rifle bullet, faster than sound, 3 times over. Outside his window, the sky isn't blue anymore. It's turning purple, almost black, because he's high enough to see the curve of the planet he was born on. Below him, an enemy radar operator locks a missile onto his aircraft. The missile fires. It's faster than anything he's ever flown against. It's designed to end his life in under a minute. He doesn't panic. He doesn't even reach for a weapon because his aircraft doesn't carry one. Instead, he does something almost absurd. He pushes the throttle forward, and the missile falls behind. This is not fiction. This happened over and over for 24 years. The aircraft was called the SR-71 Blackbird, and this is not really a story about an airplane. It's a story about what it costs a human mind to sit inside a machine built to outrun death itself, and to do it calmly, again and again, until it becomes routine. By the end of this video, you'll understand why over 4,000 missiles were fired at this aircraft across its career, and why not one of them ever touched it. But more than that, you'll understand the men who made that possible. Not the metal, the minds. This is why the SR-71 was untouchable. To understand why this aircraft exists, you first have to understand a very specific kind of fear. The fear of not knowing. In the late 1950s, the United States was flying a spy plane called the U-2 over Soviet territory. It flew high, higher than any missile could reach, they believed. And for a while, that belief was comforting. Comforting because the alternative was unbearable. A nuclear-armed adversary building weapons in total secrecy, with no way to check, no way to verify, no way to sleep easy. Then, on May 1st, 1960, a Soviet surface-to-air missile reached a U-2 anyway. The pilot, Francis Gary Powers, was captured alive, and with him, an entire assumption of safety was captured too. Think about what that does to the people responsible for national defense. It's not just a technical failure, it's a psychological one. The thing that made them feel safe turned out to be an illusion. And once you felt that kind of exposure, you don't just want a better plane. You want a plane that fear itself can't reach. That psychological mandate landed on the desk of a man named Kelly Johnson and a small, secretive engineering group at Lockheed known as Skunk Works. Their assignment wasn't just to build something fast. It was closer to this. Build something that cannot be caught. Build something that makes an enemy's entire air defense system, every radar, every missile, every fighter jet, irrelevant. When you say it that plainly, it sounds impossible. And for a while, it was. Here's the part most documentaries skip past. Kelly Johnson's team weren't just solving equations. They were solving fear. Every design decision was really an answer to a question that had a human life hanging on it. What happens if we're wrong? If they were wrong about the heat, the pilot burns alive in his own cockpit. If they were wrong about the fuel, the aircraft breaks apart at speed. If they were wrong about the materials, the plane melts before it reaches the target. There was no room in this project for the ordinary comfort of probably fine. To fly faster than 3 times the speed of sound, you don't just need a bigger engine. You need to solve a problem most people never think about. Friction with air itself becomes a kind of fire. At Mach 3.2, the outer skin of the aircraft would reach over 500 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to warp, weaken, or melt conventional aircraft aluminum. So Johnson's team turned to titanium, a metal so difficult to work with in the early 1960s that the United States didn't have enough domestic supply of it. So in one of the more quietly audacious moves in aviation history, the US government purchased Soviet titanium through shell companies in secret to build an aircraft designed to spy on the Soviet Union. Let that sit for a second. The tool built to watch your enemy, made partly from materials bought from that same enemy, who had no idea what it was for. But titanium brought its own psychological weight onto the factory floor. It was brittle in ways steel wasn't.
Rivets would crack it. Tools built for other metals would shatter it. Engineers had to invent entirely new manufacturing processes, sometimes new tools altogether, because there was no precedent, no manual, no one to call who had done this before. Imagine that pressure. Not just solve a hard problem. Solve a problem where, if you're wrong, there's no fallback plan, because you already convinced the government to spend more than any aircraft program in history on the assumption that you'd succeed. And here's where it gets stranger and more human. At those temperatures, the aircraft's own metal skin would expand, inches, not millimeters, as it heated up in flight. So the engineers designed the fuel tanks to leak, on purpose. On the ground, sitting on the runway, the SR-71 dripped fuel constantly, like a machine bleeding. It wasn't a flaw. It was trust in a process. Trust that once the aircraft reached speed, the metal would expand, the gaps would seal, and the leaking would stop. Every single flight began with the aircraft admitting a kind of vulnerability, and every single flight, it closed that vulnerability by going faster. There's something almost poetic in that. The plane's weakness only disappeared once it committed fully to speed. Hesitation was the only real danger. Now we arrive at the part of this story that matters more than titanium, more than engines, more than any spec sheet: the pilots. Flying the SR-71 wasn't really flying in the way most of us imagine it. It was closer to spaceflight. Pilots wore full pressure suits, nearly identical to what astronauts wore, because at 85,000 feet, the atmosphere is so thin that a sudden loss of cabin pressure wouldn't just be uncomfortable, it would kill you in seconds. Your blood would begin to boil at body temperature because there wouldn't be enough atmospheric pressure to keep it liquid. Read that again. At the edge of space, human blood boils, not from heat, but from the absence of pressure holding it together. And pilots knew this. Every single time they climbed into that cockpit, they were trusting a suit, a seal, a system of rubber and metal to keep their body intact. Before every mission, pilots ate a special low-fiber diet for 24 hours because at altitude, trapped gas in the digestive system expands, and at those pressures, it could cause real physical pain, even injury. They breathed pure oxygen for an hour before flight,
purging nitrogen from their blood to prevent decompression sickness, the same condition that threatens deep-sea divers who surface too fast. Think about what kind of person signs up for that. Not for one flight, for a career. Knowing that your body has to be prepared like an astronaut's, knowing that a single seal failure could kill you before you even understand what's happening, and choosing, again and again, to do it anyway. This wasn't recklessness. Interviews with former SR-71 pilots reveal something almost the opposite, a kind of extreme, practiced calm. Many described entering a mental state where fear simply had no functional use. Fear doesn't help you read an instrument panel faster. It doesn't help your hands stay steady on the controls. So they trained themselves, deliberately, to set it aside. Not to eliminate it, but to make it irrelevant to the task in front of them. That's a profound psychological skill. Most of us spend our lives being ruled by anxiety about things far less dangerous than boiling blood or enemy missiles. These men learned to compartmentalize existential risk into something they could simply work around. And they had to, because the job demanded total precision under conditions the human body was never built for. At Mach 3, a pilot covers roughly a mile every 1.6 seconds. Decisions that would take a normal driver several seconds to process had to happen almost instantly. There was no room for hesitation, no room for panic, no room for the ordinary human impulse to freeze when threatened. So the aircraft wasn't the only thing engineered for extremes. The minds inside it had to be engineered too. Not by Lockheed, but by the pilots themselves, through training, discipline, and repetition, until the impossible became procedure. Now, let's return to that missile, because across its operational life, the SR-71 was targeted by surface-to-air missiles more than 4,000 times. 4,000 times, an enemy operator somewhere on the ground looked at a radar screen, saw an American aircraft violating their airspace, and made the decision to try to kill the person flying it. And 4,000 times, that decision failed. Not because the SR-71 was invisible, though its shape and coatings did reduce its radar signature. Not because it was armed. It carried no weapons at all, no defenses in the traditional sense. It survived because of something almost counterintuitive. It simply refused to be where the missile expected it to be. When threat warning systems detected a missile lock, the pilot's response wasn't evasive maneuvering in the way a fighter jet might dodge. There was no dodging at Mach 3. The response was simpler and stranger. Accelerate. Climb. Let physics do what human reflexes could never do fast enough. A missile might be faster at launch, but it burns its fuel quickly, and it has to correct course to chase a target that's still climbing, still accelerating, still bending the geometry of the intercept with every second. The SR-71 didn't have to outmaneuver a missile. It only had to outlast it, to still be climbing, still be accelerating, long after the missile's engine had given up. There's a well-known account, described by multiple former crew members, of a mission over hostile territory where defenses fired repeatedly at an SR-71, and the pilot's own logged reaction, relayed to ground crews afterward, was almost unnervingly plain. He simply noted the missile detections, pushed the throttles up, and continued the mission. No fear in the voice. Not because there was no fear in the body. Physiologically, there almost certainly was. Elevated heart rate, adrenaline, the oldest human threat response there is. But it never made it into the decision-making. That's the part worth sitting with. These pilots didn't defeat fear by not feeling it. They defeated it by refusing to let it drive. And here's something that rarely gets said out loud. The aircraft's greatest defense wasn't a piece of hardware at all. It was a psychological principle, engineered into the whole mission profile. The idea that the safest response to danger, in this specific case, was calm, forward, deliberate motion. Not retreat, not panic, just more speed, more altitude, more commitment to the plan already in motion. Let's slow down here for a moment, because this idea deserves more than a passing line. In a strange way, the SR-71's survival philosophy mirrors something true about human beings under pressure in general. The people who panic, who hesitate, who freeze, they're often the ones who get caught. The people, and in this case the machine, who commit fully to forward motion, who trust their training and their design, even when every instinct screams to react, they're the ones who make it through. Psychologists who study high-stress professions, combat pilots, surgeons, emergency responders, describe a similar pattern again and again. The danger was never the absence of fear. The danger was letting fear make the decision instead of training. SR-71 pilots trained for these exact moments before they ever happened for real. Missile warning simulations, emergency procedures rehearsed until they were closer to muscle memory than conscious thought. By the time an actual missile lock occurred at altitude, the pilot wasn't improvising bravery in the moment. He was executing something his body had already rehearsed 100 times on the ground. That's the quiet secret behind almost every story of composure under extreme danger. It rarely looks like courage in the way movies portray it. It looks like preparation, so thorough that fear simply arrives too late to change the outcome. It's worth pausing here to talk about what this job actually felt like, not tactically, but personally. An SR-71 mission could last hours, much of it spent utterly alone. Not alone the way you might feel alone in a quiet room. Alone in a way almost no other human beings have ever experienced.
above 99% of the Earth's atmosphere, faster than almost anything else built by human hands, isolated by physics itself, from rescue, from backup, from anyone who could reach you in time if something went wrong. Pilots described watching the sun set, and then, because of how fast the aircraft was moving relative to the Earth's rotation, watching it rise again from the opposite direction, all within a single mission. A kind of experience almost no human being on Earth was allowed to have.
There's a particular psychological weight to that kind of solitude. Most extreme professions, deep-sea diving, mountaineering, even astronaut work, involve teams, communication, shared risk. The SR-71 pilot and their reconnaissance systems officer were, for hours at a time, essentially the only human presence in a vast, hostile, silent expanse, responsible for split-second decisions, with no one to consult and no time to hesitate, even if they could. And yet, according to those who did it, that solitude wasn't something they dreaded. Many described it as something closer to clarity. Away from radio chatter, away from distraction, away from the ordinary noise of life on the ground. Some pilots said it was the most focused, most alive they ever felt. There's something worth learning from that, even for those of us who will never come close to Mach 3. Extreme pressure doesn't always produce extreme anxiety. Sometimes, when the stakes are made completely clear, when there's no room left for the small, distracting anxieties of ordinary life, people find an unusual kind of peace. Not despite the danger, because the danger demanded their full attention. And full attention has a way of quieting everything else. There's another group of people in this story who rarely get mentioned, and their psychology matters just as much as the pilots. Every SR-71 flight depended on a ground crew that worked in near total secrecy, often without knowing the full scope of the missions they were supporting. They handled fuel that could ignite from the heat of a lit cigarette held nearby. They prepared pressure suits with the same care a surgeon prepares an operating table. And they sent pilots off on missions knowing there was a real chance they would never see them return. Then they waited for hours, with no way to check in, no way to know if a missile had found its mark, no way to do anything but trust the plane, trust the training, and wait for a radio call that told them everything was fine. That kind of waiting is its own form of psychological weight, one that rarely gets discussed in stories about fast planes and daring pilots. The people on the ground carried a version of the same fear the pilots had trained themselves to set aside, except they had no controls in front of them, no throttle to push forward, just patience and trust in a system built by people who understood, better than almost anyone in history, what it meant to design against fear. The SR-71 flew its final operational missions in the early 1990s, retired not because an enemy finally caught it, but because satellites and changing geopolitics made its mission less essential. In its entire operational history, spanning more than 2 decades of Cold War tension, not a single SR-71 was ever shot down by enemy action. 4,000 missile attempts, 0 losses to enemy fire. It's tempting to end the story there, a perfect record, an unbeatable machine, roll credits. But that framing misses the more interesting truth underneath it. The SR-71 wasn't untouchable because titanium is magic, or because Mach 3 is unbeatable in some absolute sense. It was untouchable because a group of engineers refused to accept the ordinary limits of fear-driven design, the instinct to build in redundancy for every possible failure, to over-armor, to slow down for safety. And because a small number of pilots trained themselves to hold total calm inside conditions almost no human mind was built to tolerate. The metal made the speed possible, but the humans made the speed usable. And that distinction is the entire story, if you strip away the technical specifications and the Cold War history. Every field has its own version of this, a version of going faster instead of hiding, a version of leaning into pressure instead of shrinking from it. Most of us will never fly at 3 times the speed of sound, but the psychological principle the SR-71 was built around, that calm, forward commitment, often outperforms panic, hesitation, or retreat.
that part isn't limited to aviation at all. It's a human principle. The Blackbird just happened to prove it at 2,200 miles an hour. So the next time you hear that this aircraft was untouchable, remember what that word is really describing. Not indestructible metal, not an unbeatable machine. It's describing a small number of human beings who chose mission after mission not to let fear make their decisions for them, and an engineering team who believed, against enormous odds, that the answer to danger wasn't always to hide. Sometimes the safest place to be is simply faster than the thing trying to catch you. That's why the SR-71 was untouchable. If this kind of story, where engineering meets human psychology under extreme pressure, is something you want more of, stay close. There are more machines and more minds behind them worth understanding.